So, Stephen, I'll jump in first. So, I'm Michael Helfrich, and I look after end user services and security operations for a pharmaceutical company called Indivior. We're a global company with about 1,000 employees worldwide. Um, Stephen, I don't know if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Rhodes with Synergy Technical. I've been with Synergy for about 5 years now. I have a background in application development and project management, but in working with Michael at Indivior, I've helped him out with, or them out with, the Windows 10 migration, as well as some of their modernization. I also helped out with their SharePoint and OneDrive migration, so very, very familiar with the Indivior environment, and got a long history working with them.
I wanted to ask if I see that we had, I don't know, 15, 16, maybe 20 people on here. Does anybody else have a role similar to mine where they look after end user services and the support teams in particular? I'll share just in case there is somebody, some of the things that we're doing. I didn't want to jump into this session, Stephen and Dan, without kind of acknowledging the environment that we're now working in,
Mhm.
and just how rapidly things have changed. I think Stephen, a lot of what we're about to show is the lays the groundwork for business productivity and flexibility in a way that 5-10 years ago we couldn't have offered our employees. But just for anybody who's on the line that's involved with an end user service organization, one of the things that we've done in the past week is just take a hard look at how are we going to continue to provide services to our employees, and I just wanted to open with sharing a little bit about that. So for our level 2 organizations, the folks that are in the offices providing direct support to users, one of the things that we're trying to think about is their safety first and foremost, as well as continuity of service should one of them get sick or have to go into quarantine. And so just some practices that we're thinking about that I want to share is we're sending just one person to various offices. So if where we might have had a team before, we're nominating one person to be the on-call delegate to get to do the tough job to go into the office if a user needs help. And that person is then designated as the individual to support that office until if that person gets sick or quarantined, we'll then move a second individual in. We're trying to really limit or simultaneous exposure risks, so that if two people were in the office at the same time, interacting with the same end user or interacting with the same group of folks in a conference room, just being mindful that they're simultaneously potentially being exposed, and then from just a resiliency of service and perspective, we're putting ourselves at risk. And so we're even for our level 1 folks, we've partnered with the company that provides our level 1 help desk services and asked them to work from home, not in full isolation or anything like that, not to quarantine them, but just, hey, instead of coming into a call center environment where there's a lot of folks right on top of each other, but just to, as swiftly as possible, as the news was breaking of cases around the country, to move that to work from home. So anyway, I did want to just kind of share at the beginning of our presentation, Stephen, some steps that we're taking around resiliency and continuity of service. So.
Yeah, and I think the what we're going to be talking about, the modern desktop, really enables that, right? So, and the fact that you now have a secure deployment with the technologies we'll talk about and how that's being maintained really kind of is key to enabling that productivity.
Indeed. So why don't we jump right in? I did a very quick introduction of myself, but just to round it off with some career highlights, I had a similar role with GlaxoSmithKline, where I was the head of user computing services, looked after the PC, mobile, and support services for 100,000 users worldwide, and have since moved to Indivior. Some of the other things that I've been involved with that I think are I guess it just puts me in a position to offer some perspective on the modern desktop and the value that we're seeing now in Windows 10 in combination with some of the modern principles that we're applying to management of the Windows 10 desktop. Is I oversaw a Windows 7 migration, 100,000 users, 100,000 devices worldwide. We implemented mobile services, and tablet PCs was one of the things that I implemented back at GlaxoSmithKline many years ago. It was the old Fujitsu Slate and the HP TC 1100, if you remember those. I'm probably dating myself here, but in terms of thinking about how do you compute in motion, listening to David's call this morning and his keynote. It really struck me about how far we've come in enabling people to work anytime, anywhere, and on anything. And so we're going to touch on how we've done that now with the modern desktop. It has been a 20-year journey for me to get to a place where we can have this conversation today. So, Stephen?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I have a background with application development. Actually, before joining Synergy, Rohana is the first person that hired me into IT, and we were working in the bowling industry. So before I started my illustrious IT career, I was creating animations for bowling. So when you went bowling, you might see when you got a turkey or something, which unfortunately we all can't do right now. You would see my animations, and those were actually sold all over the world. So just a little tidbit about me, but again, actually Indivior's SharePoint and OneDrive migration was one of the first projects that I worked with that team with. So I've enjoyed working with them.
Stephen, you shared with me, I think it was a couple years ago, so I don't know if it's still true, but that if I were to go bowling today and get a turkey, 3 strikes in a row, that the very turkey I see run across the screen is probably the one you animated, right? That's
Well, I wish I could say that was true, Michael. I think
maybe
they've been supplanted by newer animations and newer technology.
Okay.
If you went to a really old bowling center that had the old, I can't remember what the product was, maybe AccuScore XL, then you might. I also have seen some of my mass panel designs sometimes on advertisements for like Asper Cream or something, and then
Oh, that's pretty neat.
also on the cover of a magazine or San Francisco Giants program for a baseball game.
Oh, interesting. Cool. Well, look, as we talk about how ancient Stephen and I are, let's pivot now to talking about the modern desktop. And I want to start this from a perspective of where we came from and how we got to where we are now with the modern desktop, and some principles that we've brought into this, which is a build current, stay current, and stay secure strategy. And there's some challenges, especially if you think about this from a traditional IT perspective, applications and application testing, or load on the network of delivery of updates, and then also just thinking about things as David laid out earlier today, um, in that, look, we're really giving people their office. Their office is now on their PC, on their mobile device. It's not a place they go anymore. Work is something that they do. It's not a place they go. And so we have to be mindful that as we embark on a stay current strategy, and we'll get in a little bit more into what that means, but we have to think about things in terms of disrupting people's workplace, because the environment that we give them today is indeed their workplace. And we'll talk about how, as we've embraced the modern management techniques, some doors that's opened up for us on the security front. So, Stephen, maybe we'll just jump to the next slide.
Sure.
So as I talked about, there's some security things that have opened up for us. There's some built-in controls into Windows 10 and modern management that we're very excited about and leverage at Indivior. So we've got obviously anti-malware and firewall, Windows Defender. But the idea of staying current and making sure that we're prepared for perpetual quality updates and feature updates. It's putting us in that place where we make sure that our systems are not vulnerable to the latest malware and the latest hacking techniques. We leverage Windows Defender ATP for an integrated security detection response. We'll talk about what that looks like. And we also have seen as we've put this in place in actual outcomes for our end users, for our colleagues at Indivior, a significant improvement in performance and stability. And we'll close today's conversation talking a little bit about that and showing some statistics and some data. One of the other things that we'll talk about in terms of some advantage here is that we don't do imaging anymore. We're hardware agnostic. We're using runtime provisioning packages. We were a little bit early on to adopt autopilot, but the next time we do a tech refresh, we're going to go all in on autopilot. Stephen, anything to add before we move?
No, just that yeah, the runtime provisioning packages still enable us to have a set of 3 packages that we lay down the applications, or that your team, rather, Michael, lays down the applications, and we found it good during the rollout because at that time autopilot did not support I think the hybrid Azure AD, which now it does, and we're also looking at moving you to Azure AD, but we'll get into that.
Yep. Okay. So starting with where we were, this is just a slide that shows what our Windows 10 deployment looked like. Back in 2018, we did approximately 80 to 90% of the deployment over a 3-month period. You can see here we were very focused on end user experience. You can see our customer satisfaction grades there. And very focused on trying to get folks up and running as quickly as possible, minimizing the downtime for them. If this were Windows XP or Windows 7, we'd stop the presentation here. And I could go on, and I know Stephen could too. I mean, this was a lot of hard work to make this successful. But if you maybe move to the next slide, yeah. We saw this more of deploying a new service, whereas with XP and Windows 7, it was deploying a technology. And so Windows 10 deployments, what's kind of very different for us as we've embraced the modern desktop set of principles, is to think about it as that the deployment is endless, that it's a perpetual update that we're going to have to manage here. And how did we build our deployment in such a way that we could then leverage that ongoing month on month with security and quality updates, and twice a year with feature updates, and also extend those same practices to other products, like starting with Office, but even things like Adobe updates or updates to our VPN software. How do we bring those same principles and practices forward so that we can achieve a technical deployment where our tools are always evolving to be current, so that we're giving our colleagues the best and most productive experience, but also the most secure experience. So in terms of a get current, stay current model, just think about it as this ongoing perpetual update. One of the key things is to start as early as possible. I came from a very large organization that didn't have that mindset, and so this, for me and for some of my colleagues, was something that we had to break away from, thinking, okay, I'm going to take technology as late as possible, let everybody else work out the bugs, and then I'm going to do whatever I can to test every single application, be 100% perfect, make sure that I'm in complete control, and then I might start a deployment along in parallel with conversations with Microsoft to pay whatever fee I'm going to have to pay for continued and extended support. And so I think for many of us on the call, that's probably a familiar story of not starting as quickly as possible. But for us, we've had to shift to start as early as possible and start to embrace this idea that we are always going to have to take on updates, either monthly or or semi-annually in the case of the feature updates. Um, like I mentioned earlier, is that we began to think about this not just for the operating system, but also for the Office tools and then some other tools on the PC as well. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add anything here, but
No, you can see here. I mean, you're now on 1909 of Windows, Michael, with 2002 about to hit. But Indivior has embraced this modern servicing approach, and it's a testament to the fact that it can be done. So it's a lot about change management, which we'll talk about. But the idea of using different servicing rings and being able to kind of test features and validate them before you roll it out to the environment, Indivior is doing this. So all of these releases they've taken on both Windows and Office and successfully brought through their environment. So right after we did their migration from Windows 7, we implemented this servicing process and just wanted to acknowledge that this is working for them.
yeah, for a couple of years now. So
Yeah.
we're now into our second year since the deployment. I saw on David's slide earlier that he had this yin and the yang of productivity and security, and I think it made me smile a little bit because well, having running the security operations team, being very close with the head of information security, but also responsible for end user services. I know that battle, and throughout my career have lived that battle of end user productivity versus security controls, right? And what's interesting about what we're achieving is that we don't always have to see that as a choice. A stay current strategy helps us achieve both productivity for the end user, in that they're having the best tools and the most stable tools provided to them, um, as they come out from the various vendors, in this case Microsoft, but also that they have the most secure environment, and not just with vulnerabilities patched or malware plugged, or that really what it is also is that we're now able to use new capabilities, because we're as they come online from Microsoft, because we've adopted this model. So in terms of how to do it, we're now into the meat of this. So what we have set up is a process, a regular process that segments our user community into effectively three groups. So we have our preview early adopter users. We're the folks, I happen to be one of the five, that get updates as soon as they come out from Microsoft. One of the challenges you may have in embracing this is that you don't always have an early indication from Microsoft of an exact date when something's going to drop. So the way that we've handled that is we have a small group of us that always gets what comes from Microsoft on day one, so that we can, first of all, be aware, be prepared, start to look at the quality, and begin to feed into the next phase of the process, which is piloting. So we then move on to piloting to a group of IT users. Those of us who get the early release come together. We create a communication to the pilot folks so that they know what to look for. We set up regular meetings with those pilot folks. So if there's a major release of Windows, that the weeks that they get that, we have daily stand-ups with them. They can optionally join to bring us feedback. We also have feedback mechanisms online so that we can start to see what's the impact, what's the value, what are the communications that we're going to have to put in place to make this a successful deployment. So Stephen just moved on a slide because I think this probably does a better job of articulating the process. We then move on to business piloting with a group of folks that are nominated from our business partner teams as being tech savvy. We get feedback from them. We don't necessarily have our daily stand-ups like I described for our IT folks, but we do engage with them and collect feedback from them. and start to hear from them if there are impacts related to business applications that we're going to have to manage. There are rollback capabilities. We've had to employ those a couple of times, but for the most part, what ends up happening is that we just simply figure out how to very rapidly deal with any impacts, and move on. So then, about 30 days after we move to pilot B, we're then ready for the next phase of this. And as I spoke about at the beginning, one of the things that traditionally you have to think about in a traditional IT sense is what's the impact of updates to pushing those out. Sometimes gigabytes worth of updates, and pushing those out to your network. If you've got 10,000 folks in a corporate office, or thousands of folks spread across multiple corporate offices, you got to think, okay, if they're all pulling down or all getting the job at the same time, what's the impact going to be? So what we've done is we've built a standard group that for every deployment, and from quality updates through to major feature updates, that they get those updates first, so that it's a small group at each location of folks that we know tend to work in the office. When they get the update first, we're then seeding on their PCs a peer-to-peer mechanism to serve the rest of the fleet. And some 15 days after they get it, we then move on to our general release, where we are giving it to end users. All along the way here, all along the journey, we're communicating to users about what to expect, what value they're going to get out of the update, and we're making sure that our support teams are aware of any issues that we're seeing, so that we can identify any user communities that might be sensitive to the change and move them to the end group. So you can see that we have a sensitive user release. That's for the folks that are either our VIPs, there are R&D and manufacturing space, or that there's folks that have applications that were impacted during pilot. We've never had a situation where we've had to delay that group, other than for business purposes, for example, finance end of year processing, or something like that. But for the most part, by the time we get there, any applications that were identified as having an impact, they would be they're ready to take the update. And Stephen, I can only think of one or two examples of where we've had applications that were where we had change sensitivity.
Yeah, it's been very rare where we've had impacts to applications. I know there's these servicing, so this process here, it aligns to these servicing rings. And basically, if we find a problem with any of these during any of these deployment phases, we basically just we put the deferral days out. So we monitor how the activity is, and we're able to basically stop those deployments that way. Just so you know, this is using the semi-annual channel for Windows and the semi-annual channel targeted on Office when we're doing the piloting. But basically, it's what Michael mentioned. This is all leveraging Windows Update for Business, by the way, guys. And so when we're taking the updates from the Windows Update service, delivery optimization allows those peer clients to basically get the bits from one another, and you're not impacting your network. So that's one of the key things around this baseline deployment that basically lets us seed that and not impact any of the network.
We'll get into this in just a moment in terms of, okay, great, you've got a general practice for how to stay current. Now, what's the value of it? One of the things that we'll talk about is log analytics. And Stephen, I just happened to be taking a peek at our revamped log analytics dashboard the other day, and I think we're now up to 70% of our we have a 70% bandwidth savings for users that are working in the office, because they're getting their upgrades peer-to-peer versus direct from the internet. So it's working quite well.
Great.
I don't want to sell short productivity and the workplace concept. I mean, I think there's a lot of things we've just talked about that are traditional in IT thinking, But all along the way, we're also we're working with that pilot B group, that group of business users. We're working with the early adopters, and we're to try to find ways that that we can make the workplace, that someone's work environment, their PC, more effective. And so there's a lot of user comms around this, but we also do hold sessions that are open to the whole company, where if a change is significant enough, that we'll open it up to an invite to everybody to just join IT, where we'll walk through what those changes are and what they will mean to the business and how they'll make people more productive. And so we really do take that job seriously about, hey, look, this is about their workplace, right? Their PC, their overall O365 experience, and make sure that they're ready for the change, not just doing the job to get it out there effectively.
Guys, do we want to take a quick second here? It looks like we had a question in the chat from Christina. Christina, do you want to come off of mute and ask your question?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Yeah. I'm actually, looking at the Microsoft 365 suite for us, and, I'm learning a lot about the licensing. So, for this service, does it require an E3 or an E5 license?
I don't believe we've touched on a single thing yet, Christina, that would require an E5.
Wonderful.
So at this point, it's everything we've talked about. And Stephen, could you go back a slide?
Sure.
Where we've set this up.
This is all Windows Update for Business.
Yeah, so sorry. If I had us on video, then I wouldn't talk over you. I'm currently kind of in the, I would say, small pilot, ironically, 5 people in IT, and we're looking at, testing out a few things in the Microsoft 365 E3 licensing model. And so, we're not there yet with this component, but it looks like a next phase that we could explore. Okay.
And when we built these through a combination of groups and Azure and Windows Update for Business, these are standing groups. Every time Microsoft drops one of these releases, so I think, Stephen, you just mentioned Windows 2002. Okay, I thought it was going to be 2003, but I guess it's 20. We're learning together right here on the call, and we're very relaxed about it. But these are standing groups. It's not like we have to go in every time they drop a major release and make any changes. We do have a process to make sure that our pilot groups are correct and that our delivery optimization group is correct. And we just look at that on a regular, every 6 months, we look at the membership. But other than that, these are set it and forget it to a large degree.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
The other thing to note here is that these deferral days, these are for the feature updates. So the security updates are actually staggered much quicker. So I believe you take those between 0 and 5 days across all of these rings. So This is just to validate the features from an end user productivity standpoint and understand how we're impacting from a change management perspective, but the securities are set differently, just so you know.
And that's one where I think it was, what was it, September or October security release had an impact to some of our PCs. And we did have early visibility to it. We're able to react. We're able to extend that out and then wait for Microsoft to drop a new KB that was more stable.
Correct.
That looks like all the questions in chat for now. So
okay, thanks, Dan. So, all right, now, we talked about how to have a philosophy and a framework in place to get the modern desktop out there, and that modern desktop isn't really a release. It is a process, an ongoing deployment. It will never end, unlike Windows 7 and Windows XP before. So now that we're here, we'll talk about some of the advantages for the environment. So with Windows 10 and Intune and Christina, unfortunately, some of what I'm about to talk about is E5 related. we have turned on Windows Defender ATP. In fact, that's something that's a relatively new addition that we've just enabled in the last 2 quarters. And so we're beginning to see a lot of benefits from this. So one of which is just visibility into application and device usage, not just from Defender ATP, but also from Intune and Log Analytics. Some of that is focused on trying to make people as productive as possible. Are they on the right versions? Is their software compatible? Those kinds of things. But on the Windows Defender ATP side is just allowing us to identify risky software that might be in use, eliminate it, or at least ring fence it to just those people who need it, and put in place some practices to keep Endivier's information secure. So we've also put in place, just with the Defender ATP console, you would have seen this from Adrian, and even David made some alluded to it earlier this morning, was that there are recommendations for configuration changes that are coming to us from Defender ATP. What I really like about it is it allows us to establish kind of the relative value in making one change or another, and what we can do in the environment to pull certain levers or push certain buttons to make significant changes in the environment to decrease risk that might be very low impact. And so we really liked seeing that. We also, as we've enabled Defender ATP, the Microsoft CASB is beginning to see traffic, and I think this is just very critical, especially as we've moved most of us to a work from home environment. We get to see the traffic even when the PCs are remote and on the public internet. So, Adrian, I love the castles that you showed earlier, and it used to be, I mean, I think even just in the last couple of years, and for many folks, even right now, you have to be inside the castle in order to be able to see the traffic and to understand what information may be at risk based on sites users are going to, or behavior that they're engaged in. Or phishing attack. We can see that now, even when the PCs are outside of the castle or outside of out of those walls, and that's been very powerful for us, and I think is going to be extremely powerful in the coming weeks as our workforce largely shifts to work from home. Compliance is another big thing. I made a note earlier, Adrian. I have some standard operating procedures that we've written around controls, in particular for the mobile space, but also on the PC. And now that I see that I can write my own compliance policies, and that I can then print screen or take a report and send that right to our compliance team and auditors to demonstrate that we're in compliance, you better believe we're going to set that up, because it's going to make my job a lot easier next time I have to speak with an auditor about what our controls are. So I think in terms of where we're at, we're seeing the value in driving compliance and eliminating shadow IT and driving standardization. I've got a real example of that in a couple of slides where Defender ATP gave us some indication that some unapproved software was in use. And in fact, that, hey, maybe some folks in IT were themselves supporting it, or they knew some eggheads. I mean, look, we're a pharmaceutical company, so we have a lot of very talented, technically savvy users, and from time to time they'll come up with their own solutions. What's great is we have good partnerships with them, so when we see these things, it's not an adversarial conversation, but that we can help them figure out how to compute more safely. We are beginning to put in place conditional access, at least around OS version. We started with iOS and are beginning to move into conditional access for different Windows versions. I do have a standing process in Intune that can detect if people have fallen more than a couple of patch cycles behind. And based on that, it'll send an email to the user, it'll open a ticket in ServiceNow, and the IT team will jump right on it to make sure that we get that operating system up to date. So we're seeing the advantages there. Also seeing some advantages with zero touch software installs. So we've just in the last quarter stood up our first ServiceNow based request process for SAP software, where if you go through the process to get approved for SAP, you've taken your training. At that point, it's just simple as dropping a user account into the right Azure AD group, and Intune will dispatch the install right to the user. Right now, we're still at one touch, which is that the help desk drops when the ServiceNow process is complete for approvals. They drop the user into the right group, and then the job goes out to install the software. But we're just one plugin away with ServiceNow that we're working on right now to make that completely zero touch. And I'm mentioning this with SAP, but all of our software is going to that model of zero touch. So we don't use SCCM. We're just using Azure AD and Intune to accomplish that. And I think we're one of the first to do so. Another thing that we have started to do just in the last quarter is company-wide and targeted messaging through the company portal app on our phones. Our compliance team came to us at the end of last year and said, "Hey, we've got this training that if anybody is late on that training, the U.S. authorities and regulators are not going to be happy with us. What can you do to help make sure that users know that they've got this training due?" We send them emails. They can go into our learning platform and see that they might be late and the training's coming due. But what else can we do? So we have tapped into a capability to send messages through the company portal app as all of our corporate devices are enrolled in Intune. So that we can send them messages that if they're within 20 days, 15 days, 5 days, or today's the day, we send them a message. And we've worked with Synergy to automate a lot of that, and just a very good partnership with Synergy to make that happen. So using the tools that you see here, and Christina, I don't think anything I just described there in terms of messaging to people requires an E5, but just using the Microsoft E5 and E3 tools in ways to help enhance people's workplace and productivity. As we've gone on this journey with the business, we do have folks like compliance coming to us and saying, "Hey, can you put on your innovation hats and help us think through how to solve this problem?" And so we're really establishing ourselves as that go-to business partner. Look, in the face of what we're all dealing with today, gosh, I don't know if anybody else has had this issue. We have. We've seen significant disruption to supply chain with the coronavirus, starting in January with getting products out of China. And one of the things that we feel like we're in a very good place is that we have the resiliency to be able to use any PC to deploy our image using, deploy our build using the runtime provisioning package. And that we're able to have folks just work from home. We are all in on the O365 cloud services. One of our messages, key work from home messages last Friday when we saw this was coming to the US was, don't use VPN. We've got a handful of tools, SAP, so our finance folks, and some R&D tools where they need to be on the corporate network. Okay, for the sake of those folks, for everybody else that's just using email or attending Teams meetings or Skype meetings or working on documents, you don't need VPN. And it's been absolutely fantastic to not have to worry about what many other organizations are grappling with right now, which is rationing out VPN or figuring out how do they scale up their VPN service. Stephen, do you want to move on to the next slide?
Sure.
I think what I'd like to do now is just get into a couple of examples. Some of this is data that Adrian helped us pull together, and Adrian's been very, very good for my team. He came in and gave a day-long workshop on the Microsoft tools to our security operations team, and I have to say it was extremely timely in terms of turning our light bulbs on, getting our ideas going on how we can better and more effectively use these tools. And Adrian, just thank you, because some of these screenshots are from you. And I'll dive into how we're using this at Indivior a little bit more. I'll start on the left side, is that we are seeing that there's real steps that we can take to limit our exposure and to reduce risk on our configuration and with our software. And so we're using that data in ATP, as I talked about earlier, and you can see there's specific actions that if I were to drill down into Windows 10 and Internet Explorer, you drill into that, there's very specific actions we can take, and I'll touch on some ones that we've started to do. Moving more towards the right side, you can see some of those top security recommendations, 7 of 50 of them, on things that we could do. Again, this is from Adrian's environment. I would not in any way want to put Indivior's environment up here so that and make that public, but we have seen a similar list in our environment of things that steps we can take to protect Indivior information and the Indivior workplace. What's great about it, again, is just the prioritization you get and the clarity you get on what steps that you can take. On the far right is our log analytics. This is from our Azure platform. And I did take this screenshot of our environment at Indivior, and you can see where we are at the very beginning of last week's patch cycle from Microsoft. And I'm pretty proud to say that within 4 weeks, we are typically at 90+%. In fact, we had a meeting with Gartner recently where they gave us the I guess it's probably the corporate version of the Magic Quadrant, but just the maturity score that they said that we were, managed and well on our way to being optimized in terms of where we're at with maturity around managing our desktop. So this is something I live in. We do have alerts, as I talked about before, that if you begin to fall behind and there's not a business exception in place, that we do come out, we do contact you and do work with end users to make sure that they stay current. Again, for 2 reasons: staying current keeps you secure, and it also makes sure that people have the best in terms of the most recent productivity enhancements from Microsoft. Stephen, maybe move on to the next one.
Yeah, one other comment, Michael. You're right. Your version coming out is 2003. It's not 2002. I was getting that confused with Office because it's confusing. But the versions up here are reminding me that. So you had it right.
You know what? That's a good time to express some areas that we think collectively we've got feedback from Microsoft on areas to improve. We have to do a little bit more work to manage the Office updates through that concept of moving them through the piloting rings and the deployment rings. And also, there's not version affinity. They don't seem to drop at the same time. They're on their own cycles as to when major versions are released. And it's something I've given feedback to the Office team and the Windows team, and I just would say that if there's any Microsoft folks listening, we encourage you to align your Office and Windows, at least the techniques for how to manage. We've obviously built it so that we can make do, but we do see opportunity for further simplification there. So if anybody's listening, that's some feedback for you in terms of one place we've had a little bit of residual complexity.
Michael, this is Ro. I was on a conference call yesterday with a bunch of folks in Redmond and a bunch of the OEM hardware providers, where one of the OEM hardware providers said, most people who are running Windows are running Office, and most people who are running Office are running Windows. So wouldn't it be good if we could align those 2 things? And that feedback was heard loud and clear from the engineers.
Fantastic. So
just thought I'd throw that in there.
Thank you, Ro. Fantastic, and really appreciate that. So, so kind of thinking about, I'm going to drill into a risk area that was surfaced through our Defender ATP console, And that was that we had Firefox in our environment, not just Firefox in our environment, but we had a number of vulnerabilities in the versions that were being used. So before Defender ATP was turned on, we had no visibility into this. Or if we did have visibility into it, it was going to take a lot of digging into software inventory information to try to find it. This came right to the surface as steps we could take to eliminate risk in our environment. And as soon as I saw this, our head of information security is not a fan of Firefox, and I think with good reason when you look at the risk profile here. Some of these were on older versions even of Firefox. So what we did, and you can see the dates here, we're really just talking about a just slightly less than a 1 month period where we saw this and took action. So we identified the people who, through this console, very easy to identify the people who had Firefox installed. It was 20-ish to 25-ish at the time. Not a large number. But we were able to identify them, work with our level 1 help desk to have them call the individuals, find out if there was a legitimate business purpose behind Firefox. Hey, what is it you can't do with Edge? We also have Chrome on our desktops, Edge and Chrome and IE. What is it that you're looking to do? How can we help you solve that problem in a more secure way? We ended up with only one individual in the end who said, no, I have an absolute need for Firefox, and here's why. And it's a gentleman based in Italy. Due to the situation in Italy, we haven't closed out that conversation yet. They've got other things that they're dealing with at the moment. But I guess just want to highlight here, it wasn't just about being able to pull a lever and turn off Firefox, which we guess could do. We were able to have the right conversations with the end users themselves, with our business colleagues themselves, to understand were there issues in our environment where our standard solutions gave rise to shadow IT, and that we needed to do a better job listening as the folks that own the IT standards about business challenges folks were having. As I said, has resulted in one conversation where this will go on in Italy with one user and his management team. But we're approaching this from a perspective of not just, hey, turn that off, or just turning it off and having them call the help desk and wonder what the heck happened. But we're using this to drive better business engagement. Again, focusing on that, just the reality that this is someone's workplace, and that we're not just here for security, we're also here for productivity. So this is that place where that yin and the yang of the two, we brought it together to help solve a problem. So a couple, I mentioned this earlier in terms of cloud app security and the visibility that we're seeing. Again, we did not pull this from Indivior. This is, again, thanks to Adrian. But we do spend a fair amount of time in the Cloud Ops Security module looking at the traffic that is being flagged to us as potentially indicative of risky behavior, and taking action when we see it. And again, the big message here is that because we've gone all in, and in our case with an E5 and Defender ATP, we get this visibility outside the castle. So just back to Adrian's comment, here it is. A picture is worth 1,000 words, but we can actually see the activity that folks are engaged in. Most of it through Microsoft Threat Intelligence. We know we don't have to be worried about, and through Microsoft's Threat Intelligence and all of the sensors they have, they can bring to the surface the things that we need to care about. I heard a conversation, I think, Adrian, it was a question in your last in the last session about, hey, what do you do to triage? What do you do to separate the signal from the noise? What do you do to take those things that turn out to just be noise and look, these tools are doing a fantastic job for us at Indivior of doing that organically, of just separating the signal from the noise and giving us the focus on the things that we have to pay attention to keep the company secure. So, it's a really good story here that around user productivity and honoring that fact that we're here as stewards as people's workplace. So the modern desktop has had a profound impact on our end user experience. You can see here, this is the uh, call volume, incidents per user per month over a multi-year period, almost 4 years now, in this chart here. And you can see before we implemented Windows 10, where were we at? Those gray lines behind show the Gartner band of the traditional, if you're in my job, you tend to think of, hey, where am I at on incidents per user per month? And how does that fit with the Gartner quadrant? What's my, that kind of, what's my cost per call? Those kinds of things. It's superimposed on the Gartner bands there of an average of the high end 1.2 per incidents per month, low end 0.08, and the dead average that people tend to aim for is 1 incident per user per month. You can see where we were before we implemented Windows 10 and the modern desktop thinking that we've just talked about. And you can see that over time, as we implemented that, we had an immediate effect and drove down the incidents per user into average. And then as we've lived with Windows 10 and then taken advantage of it through a lot of what I've discussed today, you can see how we've driven that number all the way down to, at the end of 2019, or the end of 2019, we were running below the Gartner band. We were running at about, I think that we bottomed out at about 0.75 incidents per user per month. Think about that in terms of end user productivity. Our highs were almost 1 incident per user per month higher, which is time that they're on the phone with the help desk, that they're having to deal with, not knowing how to do something, that they're having to deal with system downtime. We've been able to convert that into uptime and productivity time, where before they were struggling. You'll see at the end of the chart, it starts to curve back up. I've already made mention of why that is. It's not because we're seeing some instability creep back into our environment. It's because we're actually starting to deploy the help desk, our level 1 team and our level 2 teams, in a very different way. This is really a 3 to 0 story. So that Firefox story I just told you, we're making use of level 1 to do higher level tasks. For example, go have those business conversations with end users about, hey, why do you need Firefox? How can we help you? Is there some other tool that you could use? Let me show you. And gosh, if we don't have a good answer here, let's escalate this to the right people in the business to have the right conversation. My level 1 help desk is starting to do that now. And that's that upswing there, whether it's deployments of a tech refresh program we have underway for our iPhones, where it's really just the level 1 folks helping the users through that, whereas before it used to be level 2, all the way to using the data that's coming out of log analytics and coming out of Defender ATP to help drive the environment to be more secure, and more importantly, or equally as important, is making sure that our users stay productive.
This is really great stuff. I appreciate you sharing your story, Michael.
Hmm?
We do have 3 or 4 minutes left, and I just wanted to take an opportunity to open up the lines, as the radio DJs would say. I see there is another question in the chat from Christina. Christina, if you want to come off mute and ask that one.
Yeah, I saw earlier that you guys, integrate with ServiceNow, and I'm familiar with that. But is ServiceNow required, or do you, connect with other service desk tools, or perhaps Microsoft offers your own? I have a pretty old service desk tool now that I want to reevaluate.
So we do use ServiceNow. We did figure out early on some poor man's integration, simply sending email to an automated bot that turned it into a ticket. But we are also working with ServiceNow as to implement an Azure connector into ServiceNow, so that we can do that in a more graceful way. I'll put it.
Gotcha. If we had like another ticketing system, though, would this be open to consideration, or is it like an
I think
API or?
no, it wasn't an API. Like I said, actually at this point, it's poor man's integration of sending email to to the right inbox. I think, Christina, you could easily do that kind of integration with any sort of like Remedy or any other platform. I had experience with Remedy from a prior job, and we would have been able to do this with Remedy as well.
That's cool. And the second question I had is, you were talking about security training and the alerts. I think that was coming from Intune, you said. So we used GNOME before for security training. Is it just a matter of, kind of getting that synced into Intune, or would that work?
Well,
or do you have to use a certain training tool?
So a couple things. One is that the training that I was referring to is we had Synergy come in, and Adrian conducted a one-day workshop for my security operations team, which was fantastic. Highly recommend it. But in terms of end user training, I don't know if York Davis is here and wants to jump off mute real quick. We do have multiple modules that were brought to us by, I'm trying to remember the name of the company, and I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank.
Formerly Wombat, then bought out by Proofpoint.
Okay, so Wombat brought by Proofpoint. They have created several modules for us to help and directly with end user training around security. So highly recommend them. It's been very effective.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any other questions from our attendees today? We got 1 minute left. I don't know, Michael or Stephen, if you wanted to put a ribbon on the presentation here with the last slide.
Just to say what's next.
I have a quick question here, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Is it possible to have employees or to offer employees monitoring their home devices, their external devices, personal PCs, without actually attaching them to Intune management and including them on my domain? Just having them forward their signaling to me, and I can tell them if there's anything wrong with their devices.
So I think, Adrian, I would want to defer to you on that one, but real quick, my thought is if they're logged into your O365 environment, you're going to get some visibility that way. But I think largely what I've shown today, you're not going to get that end-to-end vulnerability of everything that's going on their work environment. But Adrian, I don't know if you're here and could take that.
I am here, yeah, and I can speak to that a little bit. It's probably a little bit more complicated than what we get into right now, but no, you're not going to be able to get the full end-to-end data from the device, but what we can do is wrap mobile app management controls around our applications so that when the users come into our environment, we're exposing our data and our apps to less risk from the user's devices. In order to get full control over them, they would have to be enrolled in our Azure Active Directory and fully managed as Azure AD joined devices.
Yeah, and I understood that. My specific challenge would be if I wanted to have a Windows Defender ATP device outside of my domain and let them forward their signaling to me so that I can tell them what I'm seeing. Is that a possibility? I don't think it is. That's why I asked. Because it used to be last year up until about November, but from what I can tell, it's no longer an option.
Yeah, so there's not a technical limitation that would prevent you from deploying Defender ATP to a user's personal device. There may be a licensing implication involved, though. So Defender ATP is just really pulling on built-in Windows 10 tooling to do what it does. And Windows 10 is all a single code base. So, like I said, there's no technical limitation, but there would absolutely be a licensing challenge to do it. And yeah, you can absolutely, if you had a Windows 10 enterprise machine laying around that was, the user's personal machine or even a pro machine or whatever, you could actually, we can monitor devices cross tenancy with Defender ATP. That's not a challenge. So yeah, there's capabilities, but I would be very cautious of making sure the licensing was proper to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I understand that. Thank you.
I appreciate the questions. We have a couple of the contact information for the presenters here today. Michael and Stephen, thank you again to both of you.